Good evening, students. How are you? I hear it's kind of a rough week in class. Well, we're in for a really great session this evening. It's my pleasure to introduce you to our guest speaker. I'm going to read a little bit about John's background, and then I'm going to show you a bit of a video. So here we go. John Crowley is the chairman and CEO of Amicus Therapeutics. John's involvement with biotechnology stems from the 1998 diagnosis of two of his children with Pompe disease, a severe and often fatal neuromuscular disease. In his drive to find a cure for them, he left a position at Bristol Myers Squibb and became an entrepreneur as the co-founder, president, and CEO of Novozyme Pharmaceuticals, a biotech startup conducting research on new experimental treatment for Pompe disease, which he credits as ultimately saving his children's lives. In 2001, Novozyme was acquired by Genzyme Corporation, and John continued to play a lead role in the development of a drug for Pompe disease as senior vice president of Genzyme Therapeutics. John and his family have been profiled on the front page of the Wall Street Journal and are the subject of books by a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, Gita Anand, called The Cure, How a Father Raised $100 million and Bucked the Medical Establishment in a Quest to Save His Children. A major motion picture, Extraordinary Measures, starring Brendan Fraser and Harrison Ford, was inspired by the Crowley family journey. John is the author of a personal memoir, Chasing Miracles, the Crowley family journey of strength, hope, and joy. John is also a commissioned officer in the U.S. Navy Reserve, assigned to the United States Special Operations Command, and he is a veteran of the global war on terrorism with service in Afghanistan. He graduated with a BS in Foreign Service from Georgetown University and earned a JD from the University of Notre Dame Law School and also a Harvard MBA. The Crowley family was the recipient of the 2011 Family Exemplar Award from the University of Notre Dame. He is also a member of the University Council on Science and Technology at Notre Dame and is the national chairman of the Make-A-Wish Foundation of America and a founding board member of the Global Genes Project. John is a Henry Crown Fellow at the Aspen Institute. I want you to join me in watching a short video.
In both kids, it's a heart that's the real threat to their lives.
How much more time do we have?
Megan, maybe a year. Patrick, less.
I wish that we had a drug to treat Pompe, but we simply don't. I'm sorry.
Dr. Stonehill.
Yeah.
This is John Crowley. All the researchers out there say that you're a genius on the verge of a scientific breakthrough.
I'm not on the verge of anything.
How much would it take to prove your theory?
The odds against you are crushing. But where does that leave your kids when the dad has no job and no health insurance?
You're right. This is crazy. But I can't just sit around and wait for my kids to die.
I promised him that we'd raise 500.
That's all?
1,000.
Is it 500 or 1,000?
500,000.
Are you totally insane?
Apparently.
Is he worth it? The Stonehill guy?
He's really eccentric, but his science is way ahead of everybody else's.
Do you have a wife?
Ex-wives. 2 of them.
Yeah? How come?
Because I'm so easy to get along with. Figure any dude in a business suit can help me raise venture capital and run the company. But who's going to be half as motivated as a dad who's trying to save his own kids?
When my dreams are over and my feet...
We can do this. We push ourselves. We work around the clock.
I already work around the clock. Great. Cure diseases in theory, but never help a single human being in reality.
Can't cure your kids, you know that, but I think I can save their lives.
What if he succeeds too late? And what?
You're in clinical trials by the end of the year, or we pull the plug.
Nobody is going to tell me how to run my lab.
We're out of time.
Are you crazy? You jeopardized your chances of ever getting your kids treated.
We are alive. We are strong.
Do you remember you told me that I should stop chasing miracles Don't get your hopes up, kid. It's a Hail Mary.
Not gonna kiss me, is he?
I will restrain him.
Students, please join me in welcoming John Crowley.
Hi, thank you. Thanks, Karen, for the great introduction. Thanks all for being here and listening a little bit about our family's journey, which for me has been a journey in life, in business, and in living. I will share with you a number of perspectives today, and some are things that I've learned directly through experience. Some are things that I've learned from what I've read about some people who I consider to be great entrepreneurs and inspirational leaders with a very aspirational vision. Some are people I've worked with, some are people I've lived with. If you go back to the film, though, Extraordinary Measures came out in 2010, and it chronicled really 5 years of our life and our journey with our children from 1998, from when they were first diagnosed with this rare form of a muscular dystrophy called Pompe disease that we'd never heard of. I'll describe a little bit more about what Pompe is. But we were told when our daughter Megan was 15 months old and Patrick then 7 days old that Megan had this disease and Patrick had a 1 in 4 chance of having it. There was no science, no research, and nothing that could be done, and they wouldn't live to be but a couple of years old. The movie condensed 5 years from that day of the diagnosis to the day of their receiving a life-saving enzyme replacement therapy in January 2003. Condensed that down in Hollywood fashion to about 18 months. They changed locations, they composited characters, but they held very true to the science, the medicine, the family journey. They took some liberties with business, but at the end of the day, it really is, I think, a film that tells our journey in terms of family, faith, science, and business. It is, in many ways, a journey in entrepreneurship as well. It is about learning to dream, and you think about, you guys have had many, many great lecturers, and I'll just share one small set of experiences. But I could tell you from all the great entrepreneurs I've seen and worked with over the years, you'll hear over and over again some common themes. You'll hear that what they're trying to do is to dream, to see a difficult or sometimes impossible situation, and to change it. You'll hear, it's against all odds, and sometimes it is, and sometimes it's not that hard, but complications arise during the journey as well. And I think you'll see some of those key themes with us. Before I get into, I'd like to share with you what I think are some essential elements of success to be an entrepreneur, some traits I see in some great entrepreneurs. I'll give you a little bit of a background about our journey. I'm not going to go too deep into the facts and figures. There have been some great stories and books, and the movie actually captures it pretty well, but I'll provide enough detail to maybe frame the discussion. Let me begin. I got to grab a little clicker jobber here, by answering 2 questions that I get when I have a chance to talk about our family's journey. The first is, how did a movie come to be made? Well, I took you through the diagnosis in 98 to the medicine received by our children in 2003, an awful lot of work done by a lot of people in those 5 years in between. But by the time the kids had received the medicine in January of 2003, at a point where just 6 months earlier we were told that they only had then 6 or 12 months to live. So a really, really critical time for us in life, and certainly for our Megan and our Patrick. When they received that medicine, over the course of the next 6 months, their lives and their course of their disease began to change. We kind of bent the arc of the curve of their disease. It wasn't a cure, but it was a treatment. By the summer of 2003, their hearts that were 2 to 3 times normal size, cardiac muscle is involved in Pompe disease. It was then the most life-threatening aspect of the disease. It's what would have killed them. Responded beautifully well to the medicine. Within 12 to 24 weeks, both Megan and then Patrick's hearts were reduced to normal size. Their function improved to normal. For our Megan, at that point, 6 years old or so, she began to get incredibly stronger. So some really good advances, and some people had followed that, one of whom is on the right here. That's Geeta Anand, who wrote the book The Cure. Geeta had written 2 Wall Street Journal stories, the second of which was a front page story that came out in August of 2003. It was pretty neat. She spent a few months researching it. She interviewed over 200 people for that article, again, looking at the family aspects, the science aspects, and then the business as well. By that point, we had already sold that first company to Genzyme, then one of the world's largest biotech companies, company focused almost exclusively on developing medicines for rare and orphan diseases. And with that, Geeta then evolved her story, and it came out in the front page of the journal. Now, what happens when they do these long research articles in the journal, they interview a lot of people, goes through a lot of editing. It's not particularly time sensitive, so they don't tell you when it's coming out for keeping the journalistic integrity of it. So I was actually out on the West Coast, and I got a phone call at 4:30 in the morning from my wife, Eileen, who said, "You got to look at the paper. We're on the front page of the journal today." So I ran out and had to wait an hour or two till it came. It wasn't online back then. And I looked, and there it was. And the title of it was For His Sick Kids. I had my wife Eileen's pencil picture, much to my daughter Megan's chagrin that she didn't get hers. They had mine. They tell me I'm the first in my class in business school to get his pencil picture on the cover of the Wall Street Journal and not have been shot at or indicted. So I thought that was good. But Geeta's story was read by a lot of people, one of whom was Harrison Ford. Harrison that day called friends of his who had produced movies inspired by real-life journeys, including Aaron Brockovich and others, and said we should reach out to this family and think about if they'd be willing to trust us to tell their life story. We knew Geeta over the course of her Wall Street Journal articles. I'd never met anybody in Hollywood. My mom was a waitress and took care of us as young kids. My dad was a cop in North Jersey, so we didn't go to a lot of Hollywood premiere parties. But we came to know Harrison and the producers and ultimately trusted them to tell this story. It was 5 years until I actually met Harrison Ford in person. It was in a restaurant in Los Angeles. That was actually pretty cool. I will share with you perhaps the most sage advice that I've learned from anybody through the course of this. It was about this time in October 2008, right before the presidential election, and we were talking politics at dinner at this trendy restaurant in Los Angeles, and Harrison's a really, really thoughtful guy, and had lots of views that he expressed throughout dinner, and he just kind of shook his head. He said, John, he said, you know what politics really just is? I said, no, Harrison, what is it? And he said in that kind of gruff voice, he said, well, it's really just show business for ugly people. So I will leave that as my only comment on the state of politics, but that's how the movie came to be and the kids today. So they have, for 13 and a half years, been taking this every other week biologic product that saved their lives, that for a while made them stronger, again, a treatment, and it bought time in life, but also time for scientists and entrepreneurs like me to go back to the drawing board to figure out, okay, what's next? And that's one of the most important things you'll learn in my industry, in biotechnology, that rarely do you have that magic silver bullet where you develop a medicine, as hard as it may be, and say, we're done. Mission accomplished. It's usually failure, and even when it works, they're incremental but meaningful steps forward in learning and treating a disease, and that's really what we did. This is the family now at Christmas last year. You could read the sign that Megan picked out. Megan is 19 and a half, a college sophomore. I'll come back to Megan during my talk. Patrick is a senior at Princeton High School in New Jersey, where we live. And our son John is a freshman across the street at Holy Cross. So that's where the kids are today. So it's been a great 13 and a half years, and I hope we have many, many more blocks of 13 and a half years left. And again, a chance for them to experience life to the fullest, and again, maybe for us to come up with newer and potentially better answers to treat their disease. We've learned a lot in these 13 and a half years. So my Megan today, if you were wondering where she goes to college, some of you may know or recognize Megan. Megan's a sophomore here at Notre Dame. So today's topics, I'll just share again a little bit about our journey in medicine, life, and business. And I'll talk about what I think are the two essential elements of success as an entrepreneur, 4 traits of great entrepreneurs, and then just a couple of closing thoughts on what I've seen some enlightened leaders who I've observed and worked with and what they do best and who I've learned from. So again, our journey with this diagnosis of Pompe disease in 1998, we went very quickly from life in a good place. I was just out of business school. I had a lot of student loans, but we had a lot of hope for the future. The kids were little, and then life changes very, very suddenly, and it may have for some friends of yours, for some family, maybe even for some of you. It is a challenge in this world of rare diseases, that one in which we are not alone. There are 7,000 rare diseases that together just in the United States affect more than 30 million people. So when we heard this word Pompe disease, we'd never heard of Pompe. In fact, most diseases were frankly something that's supposed to happen to other people. And it changed. I'm a silent carrier, like any one of you or any one of us are carriers on average for about a dozen rare diseases. But typically through the patterns of inheritance, you don't have a child with the disease until you make a baby with somebody else who's also a silent or recessive carrier. And then even then, for this and many other diseases, it's only a 1 in 4 chance that any one of your children would inherit from each parent's copies of both bad genes. In this case, it's the defect in a gene that leads to the lack of an enzyme that for all of us living without Pompe breaks down glycogen. Glycogen is the stored form of sugar and energy that we all use as our muscles work and we go about our daily life. Megan and Patrick and those like them, the thousands living with Pompe, couldn't break down this glycogen. It was building up in their heart muscles, in their breathing muscles, and in all of their skeletal muscles. So what we knew we needed to do was to develop an enzyme to replace their missing or defective enzyme. And I went around the world and in a couple of years found some researchers who had some interest in the disease, who had some technologies that might apply. Found one researcher in particular at the University of Oklahoma, a brilliant glycobiologist, who was one of the doctors who inspired the character that Harrison Ford played in this movie. From an entrepreneur's standpoint, I had a job at Bristol Myers, was working there for just about 2 years after the kid's diagnosis, when we decided, I think more than anything, we didn't want to look back years later and have any regrets. We wanted to uncover every opportunity, every stone that we could. And for me, I wanted to be involved every day in trying to develop this medicine, because time, again, was as much the enemy as nature was. So that doctor wanted to start a little company, and he couldn't find anybody to run it. He had 4 employees, was based in Oklahoma City, and had raised $37,000 in capital. One day, as we were on the phone, and I really wanted him to succeed, and none of the big biotech companies were interested, I said, heck, Bill, maybe I should just come out there and run it for you. And then there was this kind of awkward silence, and he said, can you come out tomorrow? I said, I'll be there. So I flew out from New Jersey to Oklahoma, learned as best I could the science. There's a reason I went next door to the law school. I was not very good at science at all, and the schools I went to. But I realized once we were taking on this opportunity, I had to learn science, and hired tutors to try to make me smarter in that area. But I also needed to learn how to run a business. Like all of you, I'd been fortunate to go to some great schools, including this one. But nothing prepares you in life when you start a business with that blank piece of paper. And that's exactly what we did. The second funding after the $37,000 in seed capital from the founder was from a home equity loan we took when I left Bristol Myers and started that company. Our first home, we had a little bit of equity in it. It was about $100,000, and we borrowed that money, put it into the company. That lasted a couple of weeks as we were buying equipment and reagents and starting a biotech. Then we had to meet payroll. We met that with an investment from the prestigious venture capital firms of Visa and MasterCard with a cash advance, and then eventually attracted some venture capital, realizing within a year, as we were just moving at an incredible pace, going from the 5 of us to over 100 employees, having raised over $30 million in venture capital in that first year, that it still wasn't enough. It wasn't enough money, and we couldn't make the drug. These biotech drugs are incredibly difficult to make. You need these factories that require capital investments of hundreds of millions of dollars and years of experience. So you need capacity and you need capabilities, and we had neither. So eventually we decided we needed to partner or be acquired by a larger biotech company, and we did. We ended up being acquired by our competitor, Genzyme. At that time was the largest preclinical acquisition of a biotech company. And with that, I went to run their rare disease program, and lots of fits and starts and science challenges, lots of personal dilemmas in making sure that my kids got treated, especially after they shared that we would only have a short time with them if they didn't get this life-saving medicine. That was the fall of 2002, a long time ago. It was a really challenging time in life as much as it was in business. There is, in a few minutes, I'll play a short video. It's about a 4-minute vignette that the movie studio put together that will bridge you from the Hollywood version of our life to a real life, at least as real life as it was about 6 or 7 years ago, and a little bit more of the journey. So that's the extent of my recounting what we actually did. Let me, before I move to that, talk about 2 of what I now believe to be the essential elements for success as an entrepreneur in any business or any institution. We work in biotechnology, and that's a great big word that for a lot of people means hope. Health and healthcare are the one thing that impact every single person. It's the one part of the economy that touches everybody. You can see this quote from this ancient Greek physician and philosopher. When you hear people say, without your health, you have nothing, and certainly physical health, your mental health, your spiritual health, that holistic approach to living, they were right thousands of years ago, as right as they are today. So it's a blessing to work in this field. It is a challenging field. Science is tough. Almost everything we try, every drug we put into early clinical studies, it doesn't work. But when it works, I do think it's the best job you can have. Let me share with you these 2 elements that I see that are essential to any entrepreneur. And these shouldn't be a surprise to you. I think any entrepreneur will tell you about vision and risk-taking. But let me put it in the context of my industry, in biotechnology, because I think it's a really good template to learn from. So we have a great mentor who was with us for many years, Father Ted, who I thought this quote is one I've used before. I've never used it at Notre Dame, so hopefully it's a welcoming and familiar crowd for this quote. I get questions when I give this lecture every semester at Princeton, but knowing that Father Ted knew in building a vision here for this great university, what he wanted to accomplish and how many people he inspired in his life, and so many, at the building of so many great institutions, I thought it was a great quote to put up here. Let me turn to biotech. So ours is an industry that this year is only 40 years old, and it was founded by these 2 gentlemen. On the left is Dr. Herb Boyer, and on the right is Bob Swanson. This is them, as you might guess, from the hair and the attire in the 1970s. Dr. Swanson in about 1973, Dr. Boyer in 1973 had the idea, he was at UC San Francisco, that you can actually insert human DNA into host cells, whether it be bacteria, E. coli, or living organisms, and use those as a vessel to produce medicines. Great idea, published in the early 1970s. A couple of people began to follow it. More publications came out. Guy on the right was an associate at Kleiner Perkins, one of the preeminent venture firms in the world. Bob, at 29 years old, had the idea that, maybe we could make a business out of this. And he went and literally knocked on the door of this scientist, introduced himself, began literally writing on a board the idea for how the technology would work and how they might make a business out of it. Their meeting spilled out into the street. He went back, he was very excited, went back to his partners, and they had a vision for what they wanted to build. They were going to take this technology out of a university. They were going to find some great cell biologists to put in the company. Going to take people from the pharmaceutical industry who had a different frame of mind for how you would build a business. So they had to rely on a technology. They had to rely on entrepreneurs and scientists who had never been part of a company. So they had to go from a technology to a business to faith in building an entire industry. And they did that, and the company was funded privately for 3.5 years by venture capitalists, going public, the first company to go public as a biotech company in 1980. The company that they founded was a company called Genentech. It grew to become not just the largest, but one of the most successful in terms of human lives it affected of all biotech companies. And it's exactly the vision that they laid out in 1976. As I was reading about the history of Genentech and how they built it, all the challenges that they overcame. In building my first biotech company, what I did was I didn't start with building spreadsheets and budgets and Gantt charts and all that good stuff. Eventually we did. But started with a handful of us in the company and said, what do we want this to be in 5 or 10 years? And we spent a day or two wrestling with that, and then we worked backwards and eventually tried to marry the top-down approach to the bottoms-up and build our business. And that vision was so important. And I'll share this quote from you. Bob Swanson, the venture capitalist who went on to great fame for his vision, was on the board for a number of years of Genentech. He died of brain cancer. And Dr. Boyer, who's still alive today and still serves on the board of Genentech, was interviewed in the late 1990s reflecting on all the success they had. I mean, in medicines for cancer, for cystic fibrosis, for a range of really severe disorders for which there were no therapies. He had this, and I think it really reflects on the vision. He said, when Bob Swanson walked into my office that day in San Francisco, it changed my life, and it changed the lives of millions of patients and their families. So you've got to have that vision. You've got to start out thinking about where do we really want this to go. And I'll talk a little bit about the end as a kind of big picture reflections, but starting a business with that vision is so critical. You've got to be willing to take risks, okay? When I left Bristol Myers, I had a good job. We had health insurance, was starting to chip away at some of those student loans. I never would have left and started a tiny little biotech company with no capital if we didn't have to. In many ways, I was kind of forced to become an entrepreneur. But risk-taking is so critical. And you'll read, it's okay to make mistakes. Of course, it's okay to make mistakes. You're going to. 90% of the stuff that we put into our research labs that eventually makes it to humans never works. It's not unique to biotech. It's maybe most challenging when it doesn't work in our industry. But there's some great examples through history. Chocolate chip cookies. Chocolate chip cookies were invented in 1930. And it was an innkeeper who wanted to make chocolate-flavored cookies. So she took some cookie dough and she put in big hunks of dark chocolate, milk chocolate too. Put it in the oven, took it out. Turns out that the temperature at which chocolate melts is different than the temperature of which the cookie dough melted. And it didn't melt. It was left with all these chunks throughout. So that's how chocolate chip cookies started. Post-it notes. Post-it notes are a great little invention. In the 1960s, 3M was thinking about how do you make a better adhesive? Well, they had lots of different formulations, one of which kind of stuck, but it really didn't. And so they shelved that. About a year or two later, one of the guys working on the research project was singing in his church choir. And he wanted to tab all the different parts of the missile where they'd have to sing but he didn't want to put tabs on it with glue or tape that would rip apart. And he had the idea, well, what about that stuff that was just kind of sticky? And 3M made a pretty good business out of Post-it notes. Lots and lots of examples. In our industry, the classic example of a mistake that fundamentally changed the course of human history was a researcher around 1920s, 1930s, I forget the exact date, named Fleming, and he was looking at growing different types of bacteria and doing basic research experiments. He left some out by the windowsill, came back a day or two later, and mold spores had gotten in and ruined his experiment. He realized, though, that it ruined an experiment and it killed the bacteria, and that led to the invention of penicillin. So mistakes have been called the portals through which discoveries happen. So you got to take risks. You're probably going to fail. Anybody have any idea who these gentlemen are? No idea. So I wouldn't expect you to. These are two pioneers in our industry in biotech who I've worked with. I worked directly for this guy on the left, Henry Tremere, was the founder and for 30 so years the CEO of Genzyme company, the biotech company that grew to be one of the largest in the world, and a company focused on rare and orphan diseases. The gentleman on the right is Dr. Saul Barra, who's another one of my great mentors and serves on my board today at our company, Amicus. Let me tell you a little bit about each of them and the risks that they took in building what became the second and third largest biotech companies in the world. So Henry had an idea as a 35, 36-year-old CEO that maybe you could make a business in helping people living with rare diseases. By the 1980s, there were very few treatments for rare diseases. He went and looked, and his teams looked for technologies and ideas. They went to the National Institutes of Health. They talked to a Dr. Roscoe Brady, who had a promising program, a protein replacement therapy to replace a missing or defective enzyme in a rare disease called Gaucher disease. Gaucher manifests in patients where they can't break down a particular substrate as well. And what happens in kids is their spleens and their livers get enormously enlarged. They look like they're 9 months pregnant. It affects their bones, pulmonary, and the most severe forms can affect the brain. Tremendous amounts of suffering, usually don't live past their teens. So they licensed in this program. It was a drug that they couldn't make in what we now use as traditional biotech manufacturing through bioreactors and host cells that produce proteins. They actually had to make it as they did at the NIH for the first clinical studies in enzyme that was derived from human placental tissue, so discarded placentas, the afterbirth. It took 10,000 placentas to get enough enzyme for one patient for 1 year. This was in the late 1980s when HIV was rampant in the blood supply. They couldn't guarantee that HIV wouldn't be in the medicine. But they did a clinical study. They did it in 10 patients. They gave the enzyme for 6 months, every other week, and then they got the results. And it was an abject failure. In 9 of the 10 patients, absolutely no change. Didn't make a difference for anybody. But there was one kid, a little boy named Brian Berman, whose mom was a pediatrician, living in Washington, D.C., and they noticed his spleen was starting to go down and some of the blood markers of disease were changing. So this couldn't have been a placebo effect. It was real. And then they went back to the drawing boards to figure out why. It turns out that something in Brian's body allowed him to absorb that enzyme a little bit better. The scientists at Genzyme realized that by taking the enzyme from the placental source, that it lost its carbohydrates, which are essential for targeting the enzyme. So they went back to the drawing board. They changed the manufacturing process. They added in some carbohydrates. Then Henry had to convince his board to do another study on the heels of a failed study, literally bet the company, trying to help what was thought to be only a couple of hundred, turns out to be many thousands of people with Gaucher disease. Had to go to the FDA and convince them now to do a study again with this product where they couldn't be assured of taking HIV out of the product. But the FDA looked at it and the risk-benefit. The risks were known. The drug may not work. It may actually harm people. Well, without it, people were going to die. And they allowed the study. And 6 months later, after it began, it worked in 12 out of 12. And that led to the success of Genzyme. Eventually, Henry grew this to be a $20 billion market cap company, and 5-6 years ago was acquired by Sanofi, the largest French pharmaceutical company. It's now a standalone division within Sanofi. But the risks that he took, literally putting his career on the line to try to make a difference in these people's lives and to try to build a business, were remarkable, especially when you're relying on science. Saul Baer is an amazing story. Came over, his parents were Holocaust survivors, came over from Europe when he was 2 years old, penniless, became a chemist, got his PhD from Rutgers, went to work at a large pharmaceutical company. And he had the idea in the 1980s that you could take a molecule called thalidomide. You may have seen or read that back in the 1960s, this molecule was approved in Europe, used to treat the side effects of nausea in pregnancy, never approved, although studied in the United States. And they found out pretty quickly it led to devastating side effects, horrible deformities, children born without limbs. It was taken off the market in Europe. It's in large part why the FDA has the regulatory power it does to protect the safety of U.S. consumers and citizens. So it was the ultimate, sad story in the history of pharmaceutical drug development. But Saul had an idea that this drug actually would have powerful anti-cancer properties. So the company he worked for wanted nothing to do with it, and he ended up putting together a little company in New Jersey called Celgene in the mid-1980s, with this notion that you could take this, not used properly, horribly toxic molecule, and use it as a powerful cancer medicine. Difficult to get venture financing, difficult to go public. 3 times as a public company, he couldn't meet payroll. It took him 17 years to get thalidomide approved. Its first indication, talk about a niche indication, was actually for leprosy, and then approved for multiple myeloma. And with that early success, they reinvested all their cash flow into cancer. The upshot is today that literally millions of lives have been saved by that drug, thalidomide, its next generation drugs, and other medicines that Celgene has discovered. It's a great story in risk-taking and using a vision that he had, but taking enormous risks. This was his life, his livelihood, his career. Forget about Celgene not making payroll. He couldn't financially, personally struggled and suffered for almost 2 decades to make this work. Saul retired as CEO about 5 years ago of Celgene. Celgene today has about a $90 billion market cap, and again has changed the lives of millions of people. So in our industry, these are people who have inspired me, and many, many times taught me how to look at a problem a little bit differently and how to stay motivated. Before I share with you a couple of the traits of entrepreneurs that I've seen, I'll just play this short video. I think it'll give you a little bit more color and perspective on our family's journey, and share with you, I'll come back and share some closing thoughts. There we go. We received Megan's diagnosis probably about 9 months of age. They told us it was a very serious disease and told us it was a fatal disease. And we got the call a couple of days afterwards that Patrick, who was only 7 days old, also had Pompe disease. So within the span of those first couple of months, we learned we had 2 kids who probably wouldn't live to be 2. Pompe is a rare genetic disease. The kids, because of their genetic defect, they can't break down sugar. If you were diagnosed with Pompe disease, absent a treatment, you will die from your disease. Megan got profoundly sick. She had to go on a ventilator. She was in the hospital for 6 weeks. Her heart stopped 3 times in those 6 weeks. But she's a tough little kid. I remember looking at Megan and into those big brown eyes of hers, and she was scanning the room, and she kind of locked on to me, and then she locked on to Eileen. And, I think those little eyes, they told us a lot. And I think they told us that she didn't want to quit.
that she wanted to fight. And I think from that moment on, we both knew she wanted to fight, so we would too. We grew increasingly frustrated with the pace of research, with always seeming like we were out of the loop. And eventually, out of desperation, Eileen and I decided that we'd try to help take the lead in the quest for treatment or cure. And I went in the next day and told my boss that I'm going to step away from a secure job, and the pay and the stability for us, the health insurance, all of that, and take a chance on starting a business.
I had a lot of confidence in John, and I knew that if he was comfortable and had done the research and had done the homework and knew he could do this, I just needed to give him my full support.
I had very, very limited experience in the medical world, and there were tough times. There were times where we were frustrated, times where the kids were so very sick, and times we just wanted to let nature take its course. But eventually we saw some very positive signs, and that was just so amazingly exciting. Then, of course, you start to think, okay, how can I quickly get Megan and Patrick on it? Because I was an executive of the company developing the drug, hospital review boards were not comfortable with my kids being in a clinical study, so I made it easy for them. I quit my job. I remember the day the kids were first infused. I got to press the infusion button to start Megan's infusion. Eileen got to press Patrick's. We hadn't seen her smile in 2 years. After the first couple of months, we started to notice that she was smiling again. So that was the first sign to me that there's some hope. And then we went for the 12-week review. And I remember telling Megan, this means, Megan, that your heart's getting better. And it means you're going to live to be an old lady. And then she looked at me and kind of gave me a thumbs up and just threw her arm around me and said thank you. So that's the house on the left, Megan, right there. The green one with the tents around it.
Hey guys, listen up. We just want to introduce our real Megan and Patrick and John Jr. that are here today.
John is a remarkable person. It's the power of his love for his kids to overcome extraordinary, difficult circumstances.
John's the kind of guy who said, no is not acceptable. I'm going to find a way to turn no into a maybe and then maybe into yes.
People always say, how do you do it? I'm like, how do you do it? How do you not? I think most people in this position would do what they could to make their kids happy.
I think I did my job. As a dad, I did what I had to do. And I don't think that makes you a hero. So let me, with that added color and perspective, let me share with you 4 traits that I've seen in every great entrepreneur that I've ever heard of, read about, or worked with, or been inspired by. The first is they all dream. It's closely related to vision. Again, you don't have to work in business to be an entrepreneur. It is, I've come to learn, a state of mind, a state of being. And dreaming is not only okay, it's an essential part of it. For each of these 4 traits that I'll share, I'll give you a short vignette, a story of an individual who I think is a tremendous example of that trait. This one is a kid named Chris Gracious. So the Make-A-Wish family is an important part of our life, in our family. Megan was a Wish child in 2001, Patrick in 2003. Make-A-Wish Foundation is now 36 years old, and it all comes back to this one little boy. In 1980, suffering with leukemia, his family had come from Illinois to Arizona to try to get the most cutting-edge treatment. Today, through the gifts of medical science, leukemia is 95% curable in children. Back then, for 95% of children, it was a death sentence. Chris was really struggling, was in the hospital. One of the nurses got to be friends with his family, told him at 7 years old he wanted to grow up and be a cop. And one of the nurses was friends with some police officers. They heard about it. And they said, well, let's make his dream come true.
So Chris's dream was to become a cop. And they made that little uniform for him. They actually had a judge deputize him as a police officer, the only person as an honorary deputy in the history of the Arizona State Police. Took him out for the day, got to ride in squad cars, go up in the helicopter, play with the K-9 unit. It was amazing. Great day, and it was a great day for everybody involved who shared in the power of that wish. Chris went back to the hospital, hung up his uniform, and the next night he passed away. But the cops got together. In fact, they took him back to Illinois for his funeral. They gave him a police officer's funeral, hundreds of cars and bagpipes. It was a pretty inspiring time. But his mom and the cops got together a couple of weeks later to reminisce. She wanted to thank them. And the cops said, you know what? We could do this again. Maybe there's another kid who wants to be a cop or something else. And that's how the Make-A-Wish Foundation started. We've granted now over 250,000 wishes. And it was from those early dreamers, those early entrepreneurs, that the whole foundation came to be. So Chris Gracious, we owe a lot to, and to his family, and to those officers and the people who helped us build Make-A-Wish that has had such an impact on so many people's lives. Entrepreneurs also persevere. We are a persistent bunch. You have to be in biotech. If you don't have the stomach for failure and change and driving something to its absolute last ends of possibility, you're never going to succeed in biotech. And frankly, you're never going to succeed in any business as any entrepreneur. I said biotech was 40 years old. You could really actually, prior to any company coming together, go back and trace its roots to some of the early scientists working in the vaccine field, the manipulation of live cells. In the 1940s, the health scourge at the time was polio. Polio could be contracted any number of ways, devastating disorder. You think about the people who made a difference. No one person made a difference more in the battle against polio than this man, Jonas Salk. I don't have in my office a lot of these inspirational posters or sayings. I've got some beautiful pictures of the family and some vacations. Got a nice picture of the Golden Dome. But I've got a picture of Jonas Salk, actually this black and white, with a plaque that my brother-in-law gave me and his autograph. And I wanted to learn a little bit more about Dr. Salk. So it turns out he had done some early research in epidemiology, learning how many people had polio, eventually developing a vaccine. But in the meantime, he failed an awful lot. He tested the drug on himself, his family, his coworkers, eventually succeeded in a clinical study in 1.5 million school children. You can see just how devastating the disease was. It was something that everybody feared at the time. His great big seminal experiment in the field that was funded with millions of dollars, an enormous amount back in the late 1940s, it failed. And he thought about quitting, and he went back, and years later was being interviewed for an article, and he reflected on just how tough it was, and how was he going to tell his coworkers and his funders and his family and ultimately the patient community that he had failed. And in that interview for a magazine ironically called Wisdom, I came across this quote in doing some research. It said that as he was sitting in a park watching children play after that great failure, he realized, however, how important his work was. He saw that there were thousands of children and adults who would never walk again and whose bodies would become paralyzed. He realized his awesome responsibility, and so he continued his task with a renewed vigor. He went back to the drawing board, and thank God he did. Somebody else would have come up with a vaccine to solve the scourge of polio, but nobody would have done it as fast as Dr. Salk did. And in the process, he saved millions of lives. He actually had all the patents on that vaccine, but he donated them into the public domain because he thought at the time that would be the fastest way to get the medicine to as many people as possible. A great lesson in persistence. There are a lot of times I wanted to give it up in biotech. Even that very first biotech company, Novozyme, we did a series of experiments. I had raised a bit of money, and they all failed. And I thought, this is really bad. But I guess I got to, go back at my old job, and I realized in our field, you always fail the first time. And then you got to go back and think about the molecule and the delivery and the dose and the assays and the methodologies to validate the work you did. A lot of times I've wanted to quit. And this, I think, is one great example of somebody who persisted in our field of biomedicine. But I also said that I've learned a lot, not just from people in history who I never met or mentors that I've had and worked directly with. I've learned from people I live with every day. And one of which is my daughter, Megan, who I'd mentioned is in the class of 2019 with many of you, and like all of you, a student here at Notre Dame. Megan, you heard about her journey. The young lady who played her in that movie, they actually screened 2,000 kids over about 6 months to find somebody to play Megan. They needed to find somebody with that moxie and sass and spirit. You can't just have a 7-year-old act that way or it comes off as trite. So they found this young girl in Chicago, Meredith Droger, who was remarkable to play our Megan. And that is the spirit that she has brought to so much of her life. Yes, the medicine saved her for a while. It made her much stronger. But over the years, the medicine couldn't keep up with her growth. And she started to develop a scoliosis. Now, like each of you, Megan's an incredibly bright kid and works hard in school despite all the physical challenges. Over the years, going through public schools where we lived in Princeton, she was always there in school, unless she was really, really sick. And thankfully, that was not very often. She was there in school and working and studying. But spending so much time in her wheelchair, her scoliosis got pretty bad. This picture in the middle, I got her to meet the Jonas Brothers. So I was hero dad for a day in 2010. And you can see here, though, compared to some of the earlier pictures you may have seen of Megan, her head is almost to the side. Her spine at that point was about an 80-degree angle. A couple of years later, by the fall of 2012, it had reached almost more than a 90-degree angle. Her left lung had started to collapse. Her pressure on her organs was becoming painful, very uncomfortable for Megan. We looked into what the options were. There were no medicines to fix it. The only possible option was surgery. So we went and saw a doctor who was recommended to us, the chief of orthopedic surgery at Columbia in New York. He met with Megan. He treated her like the mature, smart young lady that she is. And he looked at her and he said, Megan, after looking at all the x-rays and tapes, he said, I can fix you, I think. He said, I can go in and we can do pins and rods and straighten your spine. It'll alleviate the pressure on your organs. But, and then he went through the buts. All the different risks attendant to not just any surgery, goes through all the complications of doing this in somebody with a severe neuromuscular disease. We're in this tiny little room at Columbia that 4 years ago. And he ended by saying, and Megan, you should know there's a 10% chance you will not survive this operation. And I thought, as a dad, my heart just sunk. I thought, okay, we're not going to do this. We were in the car driving home on the New Jersey Turnpike, and I asked her, I said, Megs, what do you think? And she goes, I have no idea. I don't want to talk about it now, okay? You let me know. It's your decision. I said, okay. And we didn't talk about it again for a couple of weeks, and I figured just kind of let it go. And then she came to me and to Eileen one night, and she said, okay, I made my decision. I want to have the surgery. I don't like the way I look, and I don't like the way I feel, and I know what the risks are. And we thought about it and prayed and ultimately realized it was her decision. And she said, but I don't want it until I'm done with school. I don't want to miss any school. So I'd like to do it in June. So we scheduled it for June. 3 days before the operation, the doctor called and he said, I met with all my partners and senior colleagues. He said, we think it's so severe that we have to break it into 2 surgeries, including putting a halo device on Megan, drilling the holes in with the screws and basically stretching her spine for 2 weeks between the surgeries. So it's kind of another punch to the gut. And we described this to Megan. She was on the phone with the doctor. She said, okay. She said, well, that's what we have to do. That's what we have to do. And she's a pretty remarkable kid. Every morning, when our house is crazy and we're getting her and her brother ready and her older brother, John, ready for school. And of course, we decided it would be a good idea along the way to get 2 Jack Russell puppies because we didn't have enough going on in the house. Megan would come in every morning when she went to school. As I was shaving and getting ready for work, I'd ask her every morning for years, Megan, how are you? And every day she would always answer, even if she felt awful with a cold or stress or whatever, said, I am awesome. I'm awesome. Thank you. And she made that decision, and she went and she had those surgeries. Ended up being 3 surgeries over 7 weeks in the intensive care unit between her sophomore and junior years. The doctor, at second surgery, they almost lost her. Her heart stopped in the middle of it. They thought they'd actually rendered her a quadriplegic by manipulating her spine too much. She came out of that surgery and she'd been laying face down for 14 hours. Her face was bloated, almost unrecognizable. It was a tough, tough night, a little more than 3 years ago. But then I thought about what she said going into the first and then the second surgery, as that we waited in the OR when they put her out with the anesthesia, kind of comforting us, and just said, don't worry, I got this. And then thankfully, they tried a third surgery and it worked. And if you see Megan here now, this is Megan at her senior prom with her best friend Elizabeth, who won homecoming queen. And you can see Megan now sits completely straight. And that spirit, that optimism, what she went through, not just throughout her life, but what she went through that summer, those 7 weeks, that level of suffering, of courage, and ultimately of optimism is just remarkable. So it's been an inspiration to me and an inspiration to many. I asked Megan if it was okay if I talked about her, and she said sure. Megan's not here tonight because she is driving with 2 friends and a nurse right now to Indianapolis to go to the Carrie Underwood concert and come back tonight. And the only reason I found out she was going to miss this lecture was because it was too close to the first of the month, and I saw the charge on my Amex bill on Sunday. I said, Meg, what's that X amount of dollars for? She said, oh yeah, I forgot to mention. So Megan did ask me to put in a plug for the Make-A-Wish Club. She said, please tell everybody hi, and she is president of the Make-A-Wish Club here on campus. She said they meet every other Wednesday night in DeBartolo at 9:15. Please join. So if you see Megan, tell her I did my pitch. But she is a remarkable person and a remarkable optimist as well. So the last trait I'll share with you is one of hope. The day that I started in biotech was the end of March in 2000 when I left Bristol Myers. When I left at that time, I had to go start a biotech company. Didn't know what I was doing and didn't go out to Oklahoma. I actually went up to the Bio Convention, annual convention, about 20,000 people in biotechnology, and I went and listened to the keynote speaker that night. And the keynote speaker was quadriplegic, a guy rendered a quadriplegic because of an accident. Big strapping guy, and he came out onto the stage and he said those words. He said, biotechnology, it's a great big word that for people like me just means hope. He said, it's hope that some of you may go back and research and find a treatment or a cure for paralysis. He said, it's the hope that maybe someday I could hold my wife's hand and walk down a beach again. It's the hope that maybe I can throw a ball to my kids again. And I understood and I could relate to it and appreciate it. But then he said something pretty remarkable. He said, it's also the hope for people who don't yet know that they need hope. He said it's that kid a year from now who's going to break his neck in a football game, or the young lady who breaks her neck in a car accident or a diving accident. He said, and they're going to go online and they're going to look for research that you have yet to even think of. And that was pretty profound as I thought about it, to realize that despite how much time it takes in our business to make medicines, how much time it takes to succeed in any business, ultimately what you're providing is hope, and it's not for people necessarily who need hope today. It's hope for people in the future. So that gentleman, too, was Christopher Reeve. And Chris died a couple of years after that from complications of his paralysis. His wife Dana then actually died, a non-smoker, died of lung cancer a year later. Tragedies. But what they did and the work that they did and inspired is just incredible. And with that, I think I'll end the part about the traits of great entrepreneurs, and I'll just end with a couple of last thoughts here, and happy to take a couple of questions. I know we're running a little short on time. Of what I've seen enlightened leaders do. They are humble, partly because we've probably failed so many times, it's easy to be humble. But I think they're also humble in success, the great ones, great leaders, great entrepreneurs. I learned this lesson pretty early on in biotech. And we took my current company, Amicus, public in 2007. It was a great IPO. We got a $300 million value on the company. We raised $75 million. We were out, they flew us around in this Gulfstream 5. We met with all these people begging to give us money. Come a long way in a few years. I was on CNBC that morning. I closed a stock exchange. For an entrepreneur, that's a pretty good day. I bust the whole company into New York, got them rooms, told them have a fun, and we'll go back to work the next day. But it had been a long business trip, and I needed to go back to the kids and the family, and I went home that night. And I went home to Megan, Patrick, and John. I checked on John and Patrick, and they're pretty sound sleepers. I gave them a kiss, and they didn't stir. And then I gave my Megan a kiss, and she's a pretty light sleeper. At least back then was a light sleeper. And she looked at me, and she opened her eyes, and she said, "Daddy." I said, "Megan." She said, "I missed you." I said, "I missed you too." She said, "How was your big business trip?" I said, "Well, Megan," I said, "you'd be pretty proud of the old man." I said, "We did pretty well." She said, "I know, Daddy, I saw you on TV." I said, "Well, how'd I do? How'd I look?" She's laying in her bed, and she says, "Well, Dad, you looked really, really," and I'm thinking CEO, I'm thinking powerful. Or she said, "Heck, Dad, you looked really, really kind of short." And there's, Megan looks at me. She's also the master at how to damn with faint praise. So she said, "But that tie showed up really well." I said, "Oh, thanks, Megs." So then she asked me, she said, are you going to be here in the morning?" I said, "Yeah, I'll be here." She said, "Would you take me to school?" It's about 4th grade at the time. I said, "Yes, Megan, I will take you to school." And she said, "Awesome." She said, "Good night, I love you." I said, "Good night, I love you." And I think I realized in that moment, coming off the high of what was a great day in business, that measure of humility and success, where she taught me that, she really, truly didn't care about a Gulfstream 5, what bank took us out, how much money we raised, TV, CNBC, any of that. What she knew was her dad was on a really long business trip, and she missed him, and he was home. And I think in that moment, I realized how important it is, not just in the tough times, but in the best of times, to do your best to stay humble. The last points I'll leave you with here without any vignettes are about taking time. You all work hard, and hard work is the price of success, but you've got to find that balance in life, not just now, but throughout your life. You've got to read. I try to read a lot. I usually don't read business books. I try to read a lot of history. There's a lot of great stuff to read that'll give you perspective as a leader one day. I recommend these 2 things to you. Read the Declaration of Independence and read Martin Luther King's Letters from a Birmingham City Jail. If you need perspective and inspiration as a leader, those are 2 great templates. And more than any other thing, I think they understand that what they were doing, what they were trying to build, that it was bigger than them. It's bigger than you. I will end by reading from the epilogue of Gita's book about our family. She, like I said, she interviewed a lot of people, and she got to learn a lot about our family and spend a lot of time with our kids. And I think Gita so beautifully well captured the essence of our family's journey, and ultimately taking it down to the concept of time. And so with that, Gita wrote, as human beings, We are defined at our core by how we respond to hardship. Writing about the Crowleys has taught me that there is not one right way, but that each person must find her own path, drawing on her own unique strength, passion, and resources. Who can say whether John's or Eileen's role is more important? Fueled by love, each of their journeys is tough, vital, and courageous. Knowing that each day really may be their children's last, these parents live with abandon, throwing themselves into every birthday party, trip to Broadway, weekend in Ocean City. Knowing so intimately the tenuousness of life, they instinctively understand what most of us forget, that all they really have and all they really are pursuing is time with the people they love. And so they grab onto each precious moment, cherish it, celebrate it, laugh at it, cry in it, and hope for another, even as they continue on the journey into the unknown and the unknowable that we all call life. Thanks. Good luck.